Most people have no idea what AI actually is. There's more hype around AI right now than almost any other technology in history. And most of it is aimed at scaring you or impressing you, not really actually helping you understand what's happening. Almost everything you're seeing in AI today, the smart assistants, the image generators, the tools wire your emails, that's called narrow AI. It does one thing extremely well. And when you find the right thing, it's extremely valuable. The scary stuff, the super intelligent robot takeover, that's called artificial general intelligence. And we're nowhere near it. AI is already shaping retail, healthcare, finance, transportation, and pretty much any industry you can name. The McKinsey Global Institute estimates that it will create $13 trillion in value by 2030. The people who are going to come out ahead are not necessarily the technical ones. They're the ones who understand what AI can do and what it can't do and how to use it to make better business outcomes. And this is exactly what we're going to talk about in this video. Obviously, there's so much going on right now with AI, and I feel that there's a lot of misinformation is also that's out there, and that's really confusing people to a point that people are getting what is called tool anxiety. I'm not sure if you've heard that before, but it's actually a thing where there's just too many tools coming out and people are feeling anxious about the whole AI thing, whether keeping up with it or how it's going to affect their job and what its capabilities are. But it's very unprecedented with the amount of hype that has been behind AI nowadays. So let's get into some of the things that are important to talk about, and we're going to cover these in this webinar. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the basics of AI. We're going to talk about the narrow AI versus AGI. We're going to talk about LLMs and work. We're going to talk about the capabilities for AI. We're going to talk about AI agents. I'm sure you've heard a ton of things about that. And also we're going to talk about how AI is shaping industries. So the concept of AI can really be broken down into 4 different categories. One of them is automation, and believe it or not, that's a form of AI. There's machine learning, there's generative AI, which is the one that you've commonly heard. And then there's the AGI, which is called artificial general intelligence. And I'm sure you've heard some spooky things about that. So automation is really about software. Traditionally, we've seen software being used for automating manufacturing, robotics, but also in just general workflows. There's a tool out there called Zapier and Make, and basically it's all about connecting different applications, and sort of there's a sequential path for getting a particular workflow completed. And so you connect these apps, and the output of one app becomes the input of the other app. And gradually these things then complete a very big workflow. And that's what we call workflow automation. But there's some AI in there as well. But the idea about it is to take repetitive tasks out of human work. Machine learning is a bit different. Machine learning is very complex statistics, and it's the kind of the birthplace of where generative AI actually comes from. And basically what the idea here is that we take a certain amount of data and we're identifying patterns in it. And there's a lot of different algorithms for that. And there's a lot of research in that area that has led to something we call generative AI, which is basically a subset of AI that basically what it does is it can create new content based on text, image, audio, or even code, using some training data that has been trained on in the past. As you've seen, generative AI has been used to create new music, new movies, and obviously text, if you've seen it with ChatGPT. But essentially what's happening in the background is pattern recognition. The algorithm behind generative AI is to look for patterns and predict the next thing that should come out after that. That thing is what we call tokens. And tokens can be in the form of text, images, all kinds of things. The other thing to mention is AGI. And that's basically a theoretical goal that is saying that once AI gets really good, it's going to reach sort of human level intelligence across all domains. And basically it's going to be able to do everything a human can do. And there's a lot of different definitions for that, but that's generally what they think of when they say AGI. Now, There's something called narrow AI and AGI, and I think I should mention that. So narrow AI are systems that are designed for specific tasks, and they're very good at specific tasks. If you notice, for instance, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, these frontier labs, as they call them, which are basically building frontier models, the base model that everyone else builds their applications on, they're also narrow in their own focus. For instance, Gemini is really great at creating images, creating videos. It really optimized that portion of their capability. Claude is very good for coding, and ChatGPT is great for other aspects of like research or even writing, but they tend to focus their efforts in a particular direction. And as a result, different people have different arguments. Someone might say, oh no, Claude is better than writing than ChatGPT, or ChatGPT is better than coding than Claude, or better than image making than Gemini. And that can be subjective. But essentially, when you think of narrow AI, you can think of that is specialization in a specific area. And many apps out there right now are being built that way. For instance, there is a very good app for, let's say, law, and it's been trained on a lot of data related to law, or sometimes healthcare. And so you'll notice that most of the applications out there are specific to a particular application, and that's what we call sort of narrow AI. And so what AGI is, or artificial general intelligence, is that it gets to a point that the frontier models, things like OpenAI's models or Anthropic's models or Google's models, they are so good that they're no longer narrowly focused in one area. They're great at everything equally. But one thing to mention is that although there's a lot of talk out there in the media, we're still decades away. And a lot of research have said that the current models behind AI is not really capable of getting there. Now, whether or not they're right or wrong, that's a different story, but I don't think we're necessarily very close to that. And I'll explain to you more as we go. Let's talk about how LLMs actually work. So LLMs break text into something we call tokens. And tokens are then used to predict the next likely token based on a massive data set. So these LLMs are trained on a large amount of data, and they're really good at predicting the next word. It's a text-based, the next piece of music, or the next image or pixel in a particular image, all these kinds of things. And that's how you get in a situation where you kind of have a chatbot, where you have a conversation with it. It's able to continue the conversation, predict what it should say next based on the context of what's been provided. So there's a lot of training data that's gone into it. They learn by processing these words that come from the training data. And these typically come from internet, books, articles, and use this training data to recognize statistical patterns. And now you're able to predict things much better because the underlying thing behind this is machine learning, and again, using statistics to identify patterns in data. So as a result, you get this illusion of understanding. LLMs, or large language models, don't really understand what's happening. What is really happening is that it's calculating the probability of the next word appearing based on its training data. So it doesn't actually know facts. You think of it as like a prediction machine. Now, what's used to happen a lot and less often now is an AI would make up stuff. And people were wondering, like, why is this happening? And a lot of research has gone into trying to reduce that. That's what we call hallucinations. So hallucinations is really indicative of the idea that AI doesn't actually know facts. It's calculating probabilities, as I mentioned before. So if the probability of a certain response is high, it'll actually make what we call confident mistakes, where it'll predict the answer, but then in reality, the answer is not the right answer. The other thing about AI or LLMs is that they don't have a physical understanding of reality. It only understands statistical relationships between words. It's very important to understand because there's a distinction here between plausibility and truth, where the system prioritizes sounding like a human and plausible over being factually correct. And that's what is very dangerous about hallucinations, because if hallucinations end up costing people's lives or creating answers that might mislead professionals in healthcare. That can be a real issue. All right, let's talk about real capabilities at this point. Right now in May 2026, we're seeing a lot of capability in these 4 areas. Text and research, where AI is being used for creating documents or doing mass amount of research that would normally take a very long time to do. So imagine like researching 30, 40, 100 websites in a matter of a few minutes. That's what's very important. That's what makes it very exciting. So it becomes kind of your research assistant in a way. Another very important area that's happening right now is coding assistance. Specifically, you may have heard of Claude Code, which is helping developers create code, clean up code, and even debug code much faster than ever before. We are seeing creative media where we're seeing AI-generated voiceovers, AI-generated media like images or movies, and it simply just comes from a prompt or another image. So it's not even that hard to do. And one of the most exciting areas is workflow automation. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we used to have these tools that were sort of based on automation. I mentioned Zapier and Make, where you would basically connect different applications to create a workflow and complete it. Well, now with AI, you can actually integrate AI into those things and do far more things than ever before using sort of automation. And so for businesses, this is probably the most important area that they should pay attention to, because there's a lot of workflows in business that oftentimes can take time, but by using AI, you can get AI to complete these workflows much faster, cleaner, and actually with more capability than ever before. I'm sure you heard of AI agents. So what is an agent? Well, as going back again to those workflows, a lot of the tasks that are done in automation workflows are done sequentially. So one task comes in, produces an output, gets passed on. It's very linear. And you can actually predict the path that it's going to take as well. So it's very certain that way. AI agents are quite different. AI agents make decisions based on the same thing that we discussed before, probability. So an input will come in, and the AI agent is connected to multiple tools. And based on the query that it's received, it will decide what tool or what application to use in order to get a certain task done. And so that's what's so exciting about agents right now, is that they're able to make decisions on their own. And that actually could be the dangerous part as well, because you have to kind of make sure that those tasks are done correctly. Otherwise, you might get some weird responses. Otherwise, you might get some results that may not be necessary what you're looking for. Now, multi-agent systems are basically when you're connecting multiple agents together to get a much larger thing done. So one way to do it is, if you're working with a small task, is to give this agent a specific set of tools. But as in a company, we have different departments. So it would be too much and more likely to fail if you give all the tasks to one agent. But instead, you have different departments, such as sales or HR or accounting or operations. These can have their own agents, and then these agents can then communicate together. And sometimes they're also connected by orchestration through what we call an orchestrator agent that manages everything. So it receives the input and then decides which agent it should relay the information to, and those agents then complete the task on their own. This way there's less mistakes being done, and you can actually track if something happens, which agent did that, and then you could figure out how to prevent that from happening again. Now, with all these capabilities, obviously there's a chance something could go wrong. And it's very important to remember that AI is just a tool. It's not a replacement for judgment. So you always need to make sure that you have some way of incorporating critical thinking and refining output. We call that human in the loop. And sometimes that is put in, for instance, let's say it's a multi-agent system, and human is put into a certain stage of that decision making to make sure that that decision is being made correctly. Some other areas that it fails is, for instance, bias in data. If a particular data source that you have that you're trying to make decisions on is biased, AI is going to give you a biased response, because remember, it is a probability engine. It's going to look at the data, and whatever you feed it, it's going to respond back to you. So there's this thing out there that they say, garbage in, garbage out. So you want to make sure that the data that you have is as least biased as possible. AI also has something called context window, which is, you can think of it as kind of like its memory, and you can only provide a certain amount of volume of context before it reaches capacity. And so you want to make sure that you are managing that context window as well as you're working with it, so that the conversations don't get too long that it does not remember the earlier conversations you were having with it. Another very important area is security and privacy. Sensitive data is also always a very important thing to consider, and especially when customers are providing data, you want to make sure that you're not subject to attacks or sort of security breaches that you might give away certain amount of information. So privacy risks is a big thing when it comes to AI. The other thing that's important to remember is that AI knows as much as it's been provided in its training data or in the data sources you provided. So it will break. It will not know if it's faced with edge cases that it's never seen before, because it's going to go into its training data and try to look for similarity matches. And when it doesn't find it, it ends up giving answers that are quite strange. Now, AI is shaping a lot of industries. One of the most important ones that is being affected a lot is healthcare. As healthcare costs are getting more, AI is sort of the solution that's being seen as a way of lowering the cost of healthcare and making it more accessible to more people. So that's one big one. Another one is in manufacturing and logistics, which again plays a big role in the automation of manufacturing. If you have more intelligent systems, you're able to have efficiency across all machines. You're able to lower the cost, especially for commodities that are being manufactured. So AI plays a big role in the supply chain of things as well. Of course, retail marketing is a big one when it comes to media generation that we've seen recently. So you're able to create these personalized shopping experiences and automate the marketing that goes into that as well. All right, so let's talk about use cases now. And when it comes to use cases, you want to be quite strategic with it. So I like to think about like the 80-20 rule, where if you can find 80% of the grunt work or the manual work that you normally do and give it to AI, you can focus on the 20% of things that really requires human judgment, then you're able to then create a more efficient output of the work that you do. The other important thing is the word prompting, which I'm sure you've heard before, where you provide a certain contextual explanation of what you want, and then the AI then responds back to you. And so the context of that is very important. So when it comes to prompting, it's very important to provide really good context. That can be things like data, it can be things like examples. And the more accurate you are with the context, the more useful the AI output is going to be. Now, one way to start is sort of build your tool belt. That's a very important thing, because once you have a set of tools that you know how to work with, then you don't need to worry about all of these other tools that are coming out, because you have what works in your particular use case. And then you can over time stay on top of it if it's out of interest, to then maybe find tools that are a little bit better. But from what I've seen, even for the last year or two, the tools are not getting that much better. Maybe they get more capabilities, but once you find something that works for you, that's really the most important thing. Now, building your AI stack is probably one of the most important things you can do. There's a lot of tools out there, and it can get quite confusing and sometimes bring anxiety, because you're like, oh man, now today I gotta read this. You don't have to do any of that stuff. Once you find a set of tools that you really like working with, that's really what's most important. Now, one of the things I don't recommend to use AI for is for high-risk decision-making tasks. These are tasks that are like have a critical consequences. And so the best thing for that is to use your own personal judgment, because if you use AI and it doesn't make the right decision, it might be quite costly. So I like the saying is AI makes decisions faster, but humans make them better. And that's the most important thing to think about when you are getting answers from AI. It might sound right, but it might not be looking at it from the bigger picture. So I talked about this concept of human in the loop earlier, and that's what we mean by human in the loop, is that it is a person that can make judgment, that is there in between to then basically just audit the response that it's getting. So I'll leave you with some tools that you can consider that I tend to use quite often. When it comes to LLMs, the big three right now are OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google. Now, there's obviously other ones out there like Grok, but the ones that I found to be the most useful in my applications, I'm just sharing you with what works for me, are those three. So basically, OpenAI is ChatGPT, Anthropic is Claude, and Google is Gemini. Now, there's obviously different types of use cases. When it comes to search, a very good one that I would recommend is Perplexity. And Perplexity, it does a great job because it goes and researches the web and then finds answers for you, which then you can use to make better decisions. When it comes to creative tools, I like ChatGPT 2.0, Google Nano Banana 2. These are great for making images. And also Google VO is really good for making videos as well. So if you want to make a short video of a product, you can provide the images to it, and then you can then generate video of that product for you. 11 Labs is another name drop that I'll mention as well. It's great for voice synthesis. So if you want to make voiceovers or your presentations or commercials, you can use it for those kind of use cases. Manus is great for slides. In fact, I used Manus to create this slide, and it just makes making slides so much faster. And they do a very good job, especially to give you the opportunity to kind of do some editing in there as well. And when it comes to workflow automation, my favorite is Mind Studio because it's very comprehensive, and you can think of anything that you want to automate. And you can think of anything you want to automate, you can probably automate it with Mind Studio. So there you have it. I'm sure this is going to be outdated in maybe 3 to 4 months, but if you're new to AI, this gives you sort of a general idea of what is happening. And if you follow my channel, I'm going to be sharing a lot more videos talking about AI specifically for business workflow use cases. So make sure you hit the subscribe and the bell notification button so you don't miss my next video.